Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. My guest today is Dr. Todd Dewett. Todd is a globally recognized leadership educator, speaker, and author of the relatively new book, by the time this airs, Dancing with Monsters. After working with Anderson Consulting and Ernst & Young, he completed his PhD at Texas A&M University in organizational behavior and enjoyed 10 years as an award-winning professor. He's delivered over 1,000 speeches around the world, including 5 TEDx talks, and created a library of online courses enjoyed by millions of professionals in nearly every country on the planet. His clients include Microsoft, IBM, the aforementioned Ernst & Young, Boeing, ExxonMobil, and hundreds more. Dr. Todd, thanks for being here with me on No Bad Questions.
My pleasure. Great to see you.
So some time in the big 4 accounting and consulting firms, some time as a teacher, lots of time helping organizations with their professional development. How does that convert to a fiction fable story about monsters and so forth? How did that
You're
happen?
an incredible business guy, Todd. What are you doing writing about monsters? I've heard this question a couple of times. It's a good one for sure. I'll try and be brief. The truth is we all have multiple interests. And for years, one of mine was writing novels. I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And this is a true story. I'm going to be blunt and candid with you. 3 times, most recently, 2 years ago-ish, I've tried to do that, successfully completed a project, felt good creatively about getting that done. And quickly, with my eyes and a few other friendly eyeballs, realized I am not a novelist. It was just an act of love, not of talent. I think that's true. And then I started asking myself after the last time, I said, I'm not doing that anymore, but I do love the idea I was playing with, which had to do with a vampire dealing with horrible, weird things at the office. Now, what else could I do with that? And I just sat there thinking about it, kind of licking my wounds as I fully acknowledged I'm not going to be a novelist. And I realized I had long admired that little slice of the business book world that did fables. I always thought they were creatively, wonderfully not normal. Would I have any success with that? And my brain just started going, and true story, I sat down, started making notes, and then I got serious about it. And about 6-7 hours later, the first draft of this book was done. It just came out.
Wow.
A mistake into something useful.
Well, first of all, that brings up a number of questions. How much coffee to grind out a novel in 8 hours? I mean, joking aside, there's people who take years to write a book, as you kind of alluded to. And that's, just heads down every day because they're doing so much research or legwork or whatever the case might be. And you were able to fire it out in that amount of time. Or was it really, or perhaps another way to look at it is, as you mentioned, you spent years thinking about it, and the work of that day was merely getting it from your brain to the world, to out in writing. What's your thoughts on how did you do that in a day?
Well, I mean, there are, that was just the first, the first draft. Certainly there were many edits after that. Having said that, most of it just came out. Lots of answers. One is definitely caffeine. I'm a fan for sure. Must have been at least 3 doses that day instead of my normal 1 or 2. I had been bubbling in the back of my head about this idea for a long time, but then the real honest answer is that it is absolutely short and simple, much like the famed Who Moved My Cheese. There's not a lot of complexities that requires research and a million notes to keep track of what you said and where that a novelist might have to keep up with. It truly is a wonderfully short, concise story, and that made it very possible.
So it sounds like you didn't have, an external deadline either. So it's not like you were already signed up with a publisher or anything like that. Are you this is out by the time this airs, and I think actually at the time of our recording, is this partnered with a publisher, or are you self-publishing? You've got such a background around the world. I would imagine you'd be able to pivot into some sort of publishing agreement, perhaps more quickly than others. Or is this self-published?
It's a fascinating topic that has evolved year over year over the last 20 years for sure. I've done plenty of self-publishing. This one was traditionally published. I've been approached and not been interested in the approach from publishers on a handful of occasions and stayed solo for a lot of reasons. But then some serendipity happens. I was sitting here one day at this very desk, and the phone rang. It was a friend of mine. He said, I've been asked to do this talk to this group, and I can't do it for this reason. I thought of you. Would you get in touch with them? And I told them you'd be perfect. And it was a good friend of mine, also an author, and the client was the Audio Publishers Association. I got in touch with them. My friend connected us. We just got on wonderfully. I gave a virtual talk to a whole lot of people at their annual conference, and then we were following up, just saying thanks to each other. It was a good gig. And the woman who runs the organization said, "Hey, what else are you working on, man? I like your style." And I told her, I just finished writing this book. It's crazy. I've never done anything like this. And she goes, "You know what? Do you know Matt Holt?" And I said, "No." Matt used to be at Wiley for years, among other places, and now he runs one of the most successful independent publishers in the country. He works with Ben Bella Books, who has distribution through Penguin Random House.
Okay.
And so I got on the phone with him. We did a call, clicked immediately, told him about the project. Boom, a year later, it's gone through all the hoops and is traditionally published.
That's awesome. And within that, and this might be one of the last topics on how the book evolved, because I really want to get into some of your leadership advice. In prep for today, I looked at some of your TED Talks and things like this, and so that's really a lot of what I wanted to talk about, because here on No Bad Questions, I always like to talk with people about their careers and their journeys, but I also like to talk leadership. But anyway, so on that background front, the element there, you mentioned there's some serendipity in there, but you've also written, obviously, nonfiction content. There's probably a lot of people out there who are like you. I want to write. Maybe I want to be a novelist. Maybe I want to write nonfiction. Maybe I want to write a book on leadership or communication or sales or who knows what.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you have for people out there who want to get started writing, maybe either as a side job or as a profession? What should they do? What's advice you'd give to them?
Well, I don't know how useful it will be, but I'll tell you my answer to your question. I mean, I've always been a guy who had words pouring out both on the page and from my mouth. So it was easy for me to just get better at managing the flow that was coming out. Other people are struggling to find the flow. They think they have some ideas, they believe that, but then finding the actual flow on a page or on a stage is more difficult. Well, what I would say to you is don't put the pressure on yourself if you've never published of having to write a great book and publish it. No book is truly great, or very few are. Certainly mine are considered good, and that's wonderful. But they're not changing the world. I can't believe I just said that. So don't put that pressure on yourself. Instead, what you should do is try. And what I mean by that is go find some people who've done it like me and talk to them. Go find some people to test your ideas on, or maybe write one chapter of the 8 you were planning, whatever it is, and share it with someone who clearly has more expertise than you. Because what you want to start doing is learning before you dive in and say you're going to commit to it. So go find people who are steps ahead of you and learn from them. That's the honest advice.
I think that's learning from the folks who are ahead of you is very good advice. And I said that was the last question on that element of our conversation, but I think I lied, because one of the things I've heard the advice from very prolific author that probably everybody's heard of is Mr. Stephen King, which is writers write. And he says, write something, write every day. Is that something that resonates with you? Or do you go in spurts, to your style? Because I don't know if there's one. I'm not a writer. Maybe there's multiple ways to approach. Maybe Mr. King, who's, again, very prolific, he's got his way, but maybe other people are sending it out in 8-hour sessions with, their big coffee like you. I mean, what are your thoughts on that specific advice from him?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's great advice. I think it certainly worked for him, and I'm a big fan. Read, I don't know, half of his catalog. It's also an interesting guy because he failed a lot before he really found an audience and then grew from there. So that inspires me as well. The truth is that everyone's got different ways they need to use their time. And for a large chunk of time for Mr. King, he was writing. That's what he wanted to do. Full time, and then over time he dabbled in other things. But so that made a lot of sense for someone who is a working author. What I would say is slightly different. I would say build a good, productive context around you that supports you being creative and productive. Make sure your friends or your family and their access to you is thoughtful, so that you can find the affirmations, the kindness, the helping hand, the distance when you need to be writing. From the people around you, because context matters so much as to what eventually comes out of your brain and not out of your mouth or your pen. And number one. Number two, at least if you can't do it every day like Mr. King, at least do it regularly. Use your calendar, put it down, block off time that you're going to choose to hopefully mostly successfully dedicate to trying to write. And the last thing I would say is don't forget that there's more than one way to write, and just letting it flow sometimes from a tweet, from a post on LinkedIn, from a blog post, from a draft of a chapter you're working on. There's 10 different ways you can think of that you might get some writing done today. If one of them is flowing, your brain's going to be happy you let it flow, even if it's not the one you were dreaming of.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much. I think that's great advice. Let's pivot now to your long career, your bailiwick, your really deep expertise, leadership, and you've got some rules that you sort of put out in the world around leadership. And I kind of want to go deep on these 5. They are, for people who aren't aware, collaborate, don't dictate, candor, not kindness, opportunities, not obstacles, authenticity, not acting, and be the change, not the boss. And let's start with, is any one of those more important than the others?
Oh, I would just be happy to submit that they're all 5 among the more important basic leadership ideas. One who's not thought about this stuff before, because the book's really written for new managers, young managers, aspiring managers, as opposed to senior leaders. These are all similarly important. I mean that honest. Now, you made me choose one. I would probably tell you the most difficult one to understand immediately, but maybe the most important, is candor, not just kindness. And the reason is obvious. Do you want to jump on that?
Well, I think that, to me, candor, not just kindness, is that every business, every not-for-profit, everything is going to have moments where there's hard decisions, and you need to be honest with people about those. That's how I would interpret your rule on candor, not just kindness. I don't know if you feel like I'm on point there or off.
Well, I think you are. I just want to expand on it a little bit and say that, for forever, I think about my dad's generation. He worked for 40 years for the same firm, that generation, a couple back, and they just kind of took orders, and they respected the hierarchy, and someone was told to do something and they kind of just did it. And that's how life worked then. We've evolved, thankfully, mostly productively since then. We started caring a lot about the human side of the equation and what it means to be kind and clear and helpful and listening and vulnerable and showing empathy, developing others. These are becoming common. I'm going to stop and say they're not everywhere they should be. We're still evolving, but they're really gaining the prominence that they need more and more. And that's part of what I'm involved with. And it makes me very happy. So what weird thing has happened in the last 30 years as we've begun to embrace those people kind of issues? This weird things happen where some groups and teams within orgs, some entire orgs, have almost embraced kindness and positivity in a way that has crowded out anything that might be perceived as negative. So, for example, candor, which apparently rings true to you, certainly does me. It's a very common high-performing characteristic of a high-performing team. People saying what they need to say when they need to say it. No beating around the bush, no innuendo. What I like to tell people is the positivity we've all begun to embrace is necessary and beautiful, but it can't be all there is. Let me say it to you this way. If you have high kindness, low candor in a team or in a culture inside an organization, you're going to have a whole lot of people that are kind of okay with being there, maybe even having a good time, but nothing truly interesting is going to happen, or certainly it's not going to happen quickly. The opposite's true. You got tons of candor, people saying what honestly they think needs to be said to move us forward, but maybe a lower level of kindness on average. Well, you're going to have upset people that can't digest that candor very well. You need both for high performance on any sustained kind of level.
And I think that within that, sticking with that one of your 5 rules, the point that you need both is interesting to me, because do you need those, or I want to pick your brain on, do you feel that you need those within an individual person or within members of a team, right? Because there's different management philosophies or personal development philosophies that some people like the strengths finder methodology, say you should work to your strengths. Others say you should shore up your weaknesses and things like this. So do you think every individual needs to balance both of those, or can you have the lady who's super candid and the dude who's all about the kindness and the boosting the team, the coach, the Phil Jackson coach who's all about
Yeah.
boosting them around? Like, what, or do we all have to find that balance within ourselves? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and you're correct. There are different views, and people debate this, and that's okay. My honest answer is that both matter. Individuals should be striving to understand these issues and be better versions of themselves as a result when they go through the process of continuous learning over their career. I think that's a valid goal. But the truth is, and I mentioned this in the book, but it's not one of the 5 rules. The truth is that teams who kill it are really killing it, not just because of 1 or 2 talented individuals, but because of this thing we call chemistry. They've learned to find that balance across people, not just within every single person. So ultimately, the group has to find that balance in order to do anything interesting. Everyone can't be everything, and that's okay. That's the power of putting together a team of people with good enough talent for sure, who can then learn each other and bring something even better to the front. That synergy idea.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. Within these rules, I started out by saying, hey, is there one that's more important, or a bigger priority? Let me ask it a different way, not meaning the same question, but just, you said that a lot of this is targeted not for senior leaders or executive leaders, but maybe newer or middle leaders in their career. Failing to grow in which of these rules would be most detrimental to somebody's career, do you think? In other words, which one can you not omit?
I got a good candidate for that one. Great question. I would say for all of the, especially addressing new leaders here, because they're a fascinating group of people who, some of them didn't even want the new job. They were asked to do it. Most of them were seeking it and did not know what they were getting into. That kind of describes the whole class there. So the one that really rings true for me is collaborate, don't dictate. Now, what I mean by that and why I care about that is because the typical new leader thinks that they're supposed to act leader-like, but they don't exactly know what leader-like is. And so they often think it means showing that they have a clue, which means saying things like, I understand this problem and that's due, and we're going to do this and you're going to do that. And now they start to try and demonstrate competence quickly, maybe nervously because they're new, with words and proclamations and dictates. That's not evil in any way. It's fairly normal and understandable, but it's definitely not productive, makes a difficult first impression. So when I tell people collaborate, don't dictate, first, let me say, I do recognize the power that someone has in their role as a leader of a team that's been designated as a leader. They have certain types of authority people on the team do not have. That's valid. I'm not saying that's not valid. I'm saying that we overplay that and miss the opportunities to build that chemistry thing that I was calling out just a minute ago. You don't have to use your authority. This kills people, but it's so true. You don't have to use your authority just because you have it. In fact, giving it away, yes, sometimes is unbelievably useful in building rapport with the humans who work on your team. The truth is, people don't go to work and want to be treated like kids in the 3rd grade. Humans, adults, go to work and want to be part of something that maybe has a little purpose with people that maybe they feel like they have some interesting rapport with. That changes the nature of whatever their work is just because of your care on that relationship side of the equation. So the one they cannot miss, if you're going to pin me to the wall, great question, has got to be collaborate, don't dictate. Don't show up day 1, month 1, trying to demonstrate everything you know and telling everyone what to do, even with the nicest of words. That's just you dictating. Instead, think of decisions as different types. I love this. I think I put it in the book. I don't remember. There's different types of decisions. There's some decisions that, well, they're just yours as the boss. Maybe it's about compensation or who to hire or something. They're never going to be wholly owned by the team. Then there's another big class of decisions that you're going to make the call on. but you're very smart for a bunch of reasons to collaborate and make sure they have meaningful voice in the process of you ultimately making the decision. Let's call those medium importance decisions. And then there's less important, but still important. And there's a bunch of them. Are we going to stay late 2 days in a row or work this weekend to make that client happy? Well, there's no right answer there. Let the team own that. And then you follow their lead with glee to show that you're in this with them.
Right.
So there's some they can own, some they should be great collaborators, and some you should own. And that's okay. You're not supposed to assert your authority all the time just because you have it.
Well, and that brings up an interesting question, kind of in the spirit of the candor, not kindness, and how you have to balance both. Collaborate, don't dictate. It sounds like there's an element to your mind of a scale there of when to collaborate and when not to. And to me, and just tell me if you think that this sort of rings true, and maybe this is advice for people, again, those younger managers or mid-career who are trying to figure out what they're doing, is I've always felt that the less time you have for a project deadline or a deliverable, the less you're able to lean towards the collaborate side. And because often unfortunately, there's not the time to bring the committee together to build the consensus. You don't want to ignore the need for consensus. I'm not saying that, but you have to err on that side of away from the collaboration,
which can be get it done.
Yeah. Or you won't get it done. And so that can be tricky, right? To not then become a dictator, or to not go, hey, this project was successful, let's do this on all the projects. So first of all, do you feel like that's an accurate assessment for leaders? And second, then how can those young leaders, is it about being real clear with expectations of the boss? Like, how can they assess? What wisdom would you give them to assess where to find that balance?
It's an interesting question. Time can be a crushing resource constraint for sure. And then I encourage people nonetheless to think of it in terms of perceptions instead of absolutes. Yes, sometimes you're going to think, I don't have time and I'm just going to make this call. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to hit your brain at all. The question often comes down to not time, but how much will the people impacted by this decision believe that they should have had input into it? Because every decision you make impacts the team sometimes zero, impacts the team sometimes a little, and impacts the team sometimes a lot. So when you think about, do I spend time when I have so little on this collaboration idea, start with thinking about the impact on them and what their expectations might be regarding the specific nature of that decision. Number one. Number two, great question. Number two, if you believe it is time to forget about collaboration because that deadline is crazy and it's here, the ideal I can't chase, I got to do this now. That happens. There's just no getting around it. So the question then becomes, how can you do that and make it work for you, minimize any possible damage associated with just making the call without giving voice to other people? And the answer is pretty straightforward, but not embraced the way it should be in practice. And that is to tell people that you're making this decision. It's going to be done by noon. I'll give you 5 minutes if you can give it. Maybe that's not what you need for real collaboration, but you're trying to give face time and you're trying to tell them, I'm going to do the best that I can. If you have a key idea, I need it now. And then after the decision, you're going to say, I apologize, not my ideal. Here's exactly what I did. And this idea of transparency is not embraced as much as it probably should be. Here's what I did and what I was thinking. You can help me grow and learn. Think about this differently. Feel free. But that decision had to be made. I apologize. I couldn't have a little more input from you guys, which is usually where I try and lean. So that's simple. I just said all that stuff to you. It took 20, 30 seconds. Just an honest confession like that and an invitation for some feedback makes them go, he's got to do a job. It's not that big of a deal what he did, as opposed to saying, can you believe he didn't even address us and he just made that call?
Right. Yeah. We were ignored. Transparency in there, big theme at the end. And I've always tried to live up to an ideal, perhaps often failing, I don't know, but of transparency with team members that I manage. Sure. Whenever possible, outside of a business need for confidentiality. And one of your other rules is around authenticity, not acting. Do you feel that transparency in the context of your rules, transparency and authenticity, anyway, are interchangeable, or
That's
are they
interesting.
different?
I think they're related. That's for sure, because when someone authentically knows someone, not the polished professional image they're trying to project, but the person, the actual person, they have a little rapport with that actual person, their actual thoughts, beliefs, interests, their family, where they went to school, some authentic stuff about the real person. They tend to feel, in a lot of business contexts, more comfortable with that person. From that, transparency often happens at higher levels just because people feel more in touch with humans as opposed to human resources that sit next to them. But for me, authenticity, I've been doing this authenticity as a topic I care about for 20 years. It's just really driven by this reality. People go to work every day and they act and feel weird and anxious, and they try to meet the impressions, meet the needs of people around them, the expectations of their boss and their colleagues and their clients. And so what they do is try to be what they think they're supposed to be. That is not unreasonable. That's a sign of social intelligence. But what I love telling people is that even though that's true, the reality is we do that so much in most teams and most organizational situations that we really are kind of distant, plastic, dare I say sometimes just fake and cold, as we play the role we think we're supposed to play. So for authenticity, for me, really is a recognition that, and we know this from different parts of the social sciences, humans preferably would have meaningful connections to other humans. Sometimes we find that difficult. That's a whole fascinating conversation, but we do want that. And yet we go to work every day and we resist that so hard so we can stay in role as a professional as opposed to being a human. Now, I'm not naive at all. I want to make sure I admit that to you. I know that we all can't be unfiltered utterly all the time, because that might scare everyone, rightly so. We're all funny creatures. But the reason I still advocate for it as a place to begin building stronger relationships is because we know that we actually resist the stew out of it all the time at work. And we have good research that suggests that when people see you as a human, not just a competent, wonderful professional, which is, of course, a foundation, but also an interesting person they can kind of understand and maybe even kind of like. I'm not saying you have to be best friends. That can be weird, but understood and respected, liked. That is the beautiful combination of professional and person that leads to trust and rapport, which is the foundation of innovation. Nothing makes me laugh more. I'm off topic here. You have to pull me back in.
You're right.
But nothing makes me laugh more than when I see leaders in magazines or videos or wherever talk about their love of innovation, our need for innovation, change, and creativity, all these related notions, when in fact they like the ideas. They like the ideas, but then they don't help people get out of that role mentality that I was talking about, and people don't feel comfortable leaving that role and saying what needs to be said, trying a new idea. Did we think about just that basic psychological safety, is what we often call it now, is the thing that's missing that stops people from embracing those higher level ideals that actually make an organization relevant for the long term. But don't get complex here. It starts with people in power running teams getting a little bit, don't want to scare anybody, but a little bit more real and authentic to help others reciprocate and do the same. That's where it begins.
Well, all right. So that's really interesting. And you said you were off topic, but I don't think so. And I want to dive into two questions, one leading into the other. The first one is, I want to be careful because I don't want us to take us down a political path, because this is not a political podcast. But it's, do you feel like the pressure to hide an authentic self is an increasing pressure in the last few years, as I think multiple sides of our political spectrum are anxious at work about showing what they believe or what they think or whatever, because they're worried about some sort of cancel culture or this, that, or the other from either side of the aisle? Do you think that pressure is getting worse? And I'm going somewhere with this.
Well, worse isn't the word I would use. I would say it's becoming more apparent that is an issue one might need to contend with as an individual in their career. In how it plays out org to org really depends. Some places, I have belief system A. If I work over there with this belief system, it's affirmed for the most part, and I don't feel a whole lot of stress about it. I could have the
Mhm.
same belief system A and work for that firm, and it could be clear quickly that I can't talk about almost anything that I believe
Right.
as a part of my thinking system because it's not popular there. So it really depends on where you work. And as with anything regarding authenticity, it starts with a toe in the water. Don't jump in and go, thanks, it's my first day, I'm glad to be here. What do you guys think about that new law they're trying to? No. You show kindness and hard work and establish for the work duties you're assigned that you can kill it. And when you establish that, you start earning incremental latitude to talk
Mhm.
about anything bigger.
Right. Okay. And so I like the nuance you brought to that question. And I think my second question still stands, but I might
Okay.
need to phrase it differently, which is we're hearing so much from so many professions about burnout, mental health challenges at work. And what I'm wondering here in the moment, thinking out loud with you on this conversation, how much is that pressure to be one way at work, which is now perhaps more visible, as you've said, contributing to the workforce's burnout? Because to me, that makes this not just a leadership. If you agree with that, and I'll stop talking in a second, but if you agree with that, that makes your leadership rule about authenticity, I can't talk,
Is that
not
right?
acting. If it's more than that, this becomes like a health imperative, right? It's not just a
It does.
leadership rule, it's a health imperative. What do you think about that thesis?
Well, first of all, there is a ton of emerging work, anecdotal and scientific, about the impact of work on our mental and physical health, and it's not good. I
Mm-hmm.
think we've all kind of known it without having the data, so to speak, for a whole long time. It's gotten worse and worse and worse. There's many factors. One of them you've just identified that's grown up big time in the last few years is just another variable, other than expectations for hours to work, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no doubt that's one of the variables in the
Mm-hmm.
mix now. No denying that whatsoever. But that's one of the reasons that I put in the book, and I put it in conversation all the time. I mean, one of my original still claims to fame is having a bunch of courses a bunch of people enjoy over at LinkedIn. One of them's on stress and burnout. So I get questions from people around the world who experience these things all the time, and it's very, very real. And we have to have this conversation about what I call fit. So you might have belief system A, I was calling it a minute ago, and
Mm-hmm.
you're working in a place where that's not great for you.
Right.
Okay. So you can profess things you don't believe. That's difficult and rough. I don't advise that. Or you can try and be strategically quiet. That can be very useful many times in a career. And if you want to take even more time off your busy schedule and take some more risks, you can think about what it means to go find better fit, that place where you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
try as hard to just be kind of who you are. Skill match, values match, all that. Fit's a fascinating journey you should care about and work on over a 40-year career for sure. So yeah, I hear you. People can do attend to this. It does get some people in trouble. I know that. The question then really long term is, what do you care about? How much do you care about it? And are you willing to take some hours and some
Mm-hmm.
risks to go find better fit? You have to think long term. This career thing is definitely a marathon, not a race.
Mm-hmm. I've heard the marathon, not a race thing several times from mentors in my career, and it's hard to hear when
Yeah.
you're 25
Yeah.
and want a promotion, want to rise up, want to use the master's degree you just got, and you got a bunch of student loans, whatever the case might be, right? People out there, it's hard to hear, oh, well, you're in the first leg of your marathon.
It is hard, and a lot of people accuse the young generation and younger generation, especially Z's and the younger millennials, with you can hear the old guy in me coming out because I'm 52. I try to act like I'm 35. But you can hear the older people, especially the remaining boomers, say, they want something without earning it. Where's the work
Mm-hmm.
ethic and the putting in your time and all that? I think that's an overplayed thing, but not 100% illogical to think
Mm-hmm.
about or to talk about and to cast towards them at all. I think most of us overplay too many of these things when we're looking for someone to blame. It's a terrible human tendency, but there's something to that. So you got people like me that are trying to talk to Z's and say purpose matters, fit matters. Let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about the enlightened version of what a career could be. And I love being that person. But then they go to work and they have Joe or Barbara as their boss. And that person's kind of just getting by and stressed out with 3 kids, and they're divorced, and they don't have time to think about collaborate, don't dictate, et cetera, et cetera. When I was teaching MBAs for years, they would come back to me and tell me, man, I was so jacked up after that lecture last night. We had such a great conversation. Then I went to work and I said, this will never, ever happen where I'm working. So you're setting me up to be unhappy, Todd. I heard that many times. And what I say to you, and I say it without flinching, I'm sorry if someone doesn't want to hear this, but chasing career happiness takes time, hard work, and risks and sacrifice. Not a joke.
Yeah, I've certainly found that to be very, very true. And I'd like to think that I'm relatively successful in my field, in my career. And so for the amount that it's worth, I'll certainly vouch for that. You're very successful. I think that's very wise. And so let me bring us to, not in any particular order, rule number 4 of your 5. Be the change, not the boss. And I want to spin that a little bit, because you just talked about fit and potentially finding a change in your work environment to increase fit and so forth. So this rule seems to me to be, being that it's phrased, be the change, not the boss, to be pointed towards your team. But leadership can be about managing sideways and can be about managing up. So how can be the change, not the boss, apply to managing up? Because if you've got Brenda, the retired in place person, as the boss, like you said, maybe the best way to get the fit is to try to figure out how to work with Brenda to get the change that way. So how does this rule apply to managing up?
Well, it's interesting the way you phrase that, because no matter how long you're going to be there, no matter what your goals are, you still got to find a way to optimize working with Brenda. Those retired on the job folks are interesting, and they exist. So yeah, I was definitely thinking about the team, because I wrote with a simple team approach to the book instead of a more systemic view. But you're on the money. Leadership goes in all directions. I have a course called Leading in All Directions. So you pulled that out. Thank you, sir. What I would say is the intent of the rule really is about understanding the power of modeling behaviors and vicarious learning, as opposed to dictating that which we should all be doing. So parents, leaders of all types, all of us who have authority over other humans, we can say that which needs to be done and how one should think and act and be, or we can live it and let others see it. And what the research, again, in several different areas, from management to educational psychology, et cetera, they tell us that people learn quite well from vicarious learning. And the idea is simple. If someone, for example, is watching the boss, a word we're not supposed to use much anymore. I'm trying to train myself to say supervisor more and more. But if they're watching the boss have a big interaction with a client or a colleague, someone not them, they can take that in and think about it at a higher level, whatever level that is, than if they're actually involved in that interaction, where then we have a lot of human weirdness going on, where we're trying to think about what I should say and other things that happen if we're involved in that conversation. So the rule's very simple. Minimize how much you say how we should do things, how we should behave, treat each other, and maximize how you try to actually show that in your behaviors every day. And that's how you're eventually going to impact people. When they see what you do, they're much more likely to do something similar.
I've become bought in to remote work, not universally. It depends on the role, depends on the person, depends on their personality. But I've become very bought in over the last couple of years. I was remote for about 3. I'm back on site now. But I wonder, does remote work inhibit some of that behavior modeling that you're talking about? And if you agree with the idea that it might, do you have any advice for again, people entering the workforce? A lot of them might be in tech jobs or other jobs that are remote. How are you supposed to model if nobody sees you, in between meetings or in those hallway conversations? Any advice to worker or mid-career people who are remote? Any advice to those folks on how they can model these behaviors that you're talking about in this rule?
Oh, you're going to laugh. I've got a course called How to Lead Remotely. I do. So
I promise I didn't read your whole course list, before we started.
Well, that's okay. I'm that guy. I've got 40 courses currently over there. So I'm kind of one of those guys that just got lucky and grew in their library. Anyhow, so it doesn't prohibit modeling behaviors that matter. It is a challenge. clear, extra challenge. No doubt about that. So you don't get the face-to-face in the traditional sense. Maybe you get a smaller quantity overall of interaction. That is the challenge, the extra challenge. But there are expectations and interactions that happen. So the degree to which you can facilitate the various meetings that you have in a way that meets expectations and or empowers people, makes them feel okay about what they're doing and more capable of what they're doing, you can still work all the magic you want to work and through showing the right behaviors. Let me give you an example. You don't want to have remote work go like this. The boss logs on to the weekly Tuesday meeting and everyone logs on and then looks at him or her, and that person then goes, well, we have 4 items on the agenda, and everyone sits there quietly and listens, and then the input comes if needed from other people. That's tried and true and boring, and that's why the people who hate remote work hate remote work. The truth is that when you turn on that camera, like we're looking through right now, it can be managed in many different ways. So one way to model behaviors remotely would be to switch up who owns what over time. Can I intentionally share the leadership role so that certain people lead certain meetings and certain tasks without me having to act like I'm in that chair of the leader all the time? Let others own things. Number one. Number two, do unscheduled things where you're trying to share great news or praise people for something that they did that was spectacular. There's plenty of ways. Oh, keep your word, by the way. If you say you're going to do the big meeting on Tuesday with the 10 of us on the team, then don't be the last person that logs into that meeting. So doing what you say you're going to do, sharing more ownership, doing a few creative unplanned things, those are great ways to model that you get who they are, what their contribution is, and that you respect their time. It's harder, yes, you're right, but it's still possible.
Love it. Last but not least, opportunities, not obstacles. Is this just a positive gimme, because it seems sort of uplift? Hey, opportunities, not obstacles. Or is there more to this? Can you elaborate on it for the audience?
Well, I actually think this is one of those ideas that's so simple that we fail sometimes to give it the understand the weight that it really carries. So the punchline to that rule is that perspective matters, and perspective is a choice you can make, and perspective is a thing you can share as a person who has power and that impacts others. I have a story I use in one of my keynotes. It actually became a TEDx online, a virtual deal you could go listen to. It's about my dad and some of the things he taught me during his cancer with journey. It's an emotional, honest, real story. The biggest punchline really is about perspective, though. And in the story case, he had a choice about how to deal with a very difficult situation. Am I angry, for example, or am I going to choose to see the glass half full, find the silver lining, etc., which he did in a profound way that I've never seen anyone else so successfully do. And it was life-changing, to be honest with you, to watch him do that. And so I like to remind people, there's actually lots of research out there over the years on framing. They call it different things. Framing is the most common. Yep. So when a boss has an idea, I got to share it with the team. The client wants this. The deadline changed. Resources have changed, et cetera. Whatever it is, you can make a choice. It requires a little bit of planning, but we're talking seconds or a minute or two, not much. A little bit of planning to choose how to say that with the right tone, the right words that create this is not bad. It is on balance good for us, and we're going to get this done. Don't worry. That's a choice of perspective. Now, it's a creative thing you got to do. It's not easy all the time, but that is the task before you. And here's the punchline. We know that when you do that and you make that choice and you deliver sometimes difficult things to teams, and you do so from a positive perspective, a positive framing, over time, on average, they do react more effectively to it. That's a simple, beautiful, huge fact. And it's just because you were thoughtful enough to choose words. Opportunities, not obstacles, is just a reminder that perspective is everything, and they'll often take the perspective that you share. So be thoughtful about how you share.
I think these are all really great rules, and certainly on a couple of them, as we've talked through them, given me some really interesting thoughts on leadership or communication. I want to take, as we head into the tail end of our time, I want to take some opportunity to ask 2 questions in particular. We mentioned, career is a marathon, and that can be a tough pill to swallow, and that, certain lessons can take years to learn. So what is one thing that you would want, if you had to boil it all down, one thing that you would want a young leader, they need to fast track if they can, that normally comes from years of wisdom, but they need to go read some books. They need to, watch all your lessons, whatever the case might be. What's one thing that a new leader needs to get on the fast track as much as they can to have that successful career?
I think I have 50 answers to that. I'm going to give you one because you asked for one, and I'm going to give you this particular one because it's one I screwed up, and I love the idea that others don't have to screw it up like I did.
Love it.
Smart people in general, we think we know too much. We think we know more than we do. Hate to break it to you. It's very, very true, which is why you're going to humble yourself. You mentioned that 25-year-old wants to use that grad degree, fast track promotion. I'm talking to them. You got to laugh and admit first to yourself that you don't know it all and that that's just fine and completely normal. And then you're going to deal with it and accelerate by going to join up with someone who can be a mentor to you. Humble yourself and go find a mentor who's willing to start spilling out some of what they've learned to you. They'll give you network connections. They'll give you insights about decision making. They're going to tell you about yourself, what you don't see in yourself, for better or for worse. It's humbling. And if you find the right one, that can be a challenge too sometimes. It is exhilarating because I tell you this, when we look in the mirror, you just don't see what everyone else sees.
Right.
So to those young people, the one piece of advice is that's okay. Admit it and go hook up with a great mentor who can start helping you see yourself and possible paths forward more clearly.
When I talked to Major General retired John Hussey, he talked about mentorship and how that was such a passion for him. And he and I talked about this same question, which is finding mentors. And you just mentioned that it can be hard. So I guess sub question, I said I had two big ones. We're still on question one. Sub question. How does somebody out there who maybe, I think a lot of our young workers have gotten good educations, have good skills, have what's needed to succeed, except we've not done a good job, I think, of preparing them for the modern workplace. And so how do they even know how to find a good mentor?
Well, I have a course on that, first of all. And, sorry, it's just a joke of our talk now.
Yeah.
It's not always easy. A couple thoughts. First of all, whether you know it or not, you are kind of giving out signals and vibes about who you are and what you're capable of all the time that you're not aware of how other people are or are not picking them up and what they're saying about you, which leads me to say, focus sincerely on a great work ethic and an above average work product, whatever it is that you're doing, because others will know about that in different ways, in ways that you won't know. So that's kind of tilling the soil around you before you jump in and look for that mentor. You want to be giving off the right vibes. Next, don't assume they're going to say yes or no. Don't assume anything. Approach people who you think are interesting, not just based on personality. That would be nice if they seemed kind, but mostly based on the things they've accomplished, what they're regarded as knowing and having accomplished. That's a big thing. And tell them something other than, I need your help. You want to come to them and say, I appreciate what you said at the meeting last week. That kind of struck a chord with me. I just want to come by and chew the fat for 5 minutes. Can I get on your schedule, or are you free for 5 minutes? Find some honest connection based on something they've done that helped you to try and start that conversation. You're going to do that over the first 2-3 years of your career with a good handful of people. Why? Because sometimes it's just going to grow in that soil that we were talking about and sprout something. And sometimes it won't. That's fine. People don't always mix as well as you might think they would. That's okay, which is why you're going to do multiple of those till you find one or two that start to grow a little bit. That's the honest advice. You got to do the work, plant the seeds, see what grows.
Love it. Okay. So now question two of the two questions. The first was,
Yes,
around young people and trying to accelerate some lesson for them. Now let's talk about middle career and even more senior career leaders. You've interacted with a lot of them, I'm sure. You're probably going to have a course on what I'm going to ask. What is a lesson that we need to, you and I need to remind them about that they probably learned when they were a young leader and somehow forgot? What do seasoned leaders need to do a better job of keeping more forefront in their behavior and in their mind that you see is a common thing?
It's a particularly relevant question. We have more generations represented in today's workforce than at any other time, which is crazy and fascinating all at the same time. And I would say to them, and I have said to them, and it is fun and scary at the same time when I do this, when you're talking to senior people especially, You have forgotten where you came from. You have forgotten who you were. There was a time that you knew 5% of what you know right now, and yet you were still working hard and trying and dreaming and thinking you needed that promotion, et cetera, et cetera. Do you remember that person? We play a little game just walking them through thinking about that person. Well, they're not that different from you if you can remember that you were once them. They do different music, different attire, a slightly different vocabulary, same situation though. And then you got to say, but you know what? They look a little different. They're really not. But I know that you care about making inroads with them, building bridges. Why? Because you care about performance. You care about relationships, but ultimately, you know what? I know you care about performance. Great performance doesn't happen unless you find a way to go build bridges with this incoming huge mass of Z's and the takeover at middle management of millennials. You know, you've got to do that. And there's an easy answer to doing that. Number one, you got to have more senior people hang out with more junior people. More senior people in their personal board of mentors that they have. Absolutely better have at least one person who's 20 years younger than them. That's a new concept to a lot of people, but it's true. It's funny. It's useful. And then the people who are senior, who have a natural affinity, if you're a senior person and you see a senior to mid-level person who has a natural affinity to caring about, understanding, not having a problem with the youth that's taking over the org, you get them involved because they're already naturally inclined to build those bridges. You got to go leverage that and help them help infect others with the same mentality. And last but not least, this is the most difficult and the most powerful part of the answer. If you're a believer and you're a senior leader, and I'm not having to convince you, I'm just trying to help you accelerate the getting together of generations and the rise of power, frankly, in the younger generations, you have to move some of them higher quicker than you normally do. The highest talent, that's of course what you want to go for, has got to be accelerated, much like we have special programs for people who've been designated as future leaders in organizations and things like that, because there's nothing that helps people talk on a more respectful level than having similar-ish status. That helps, even if it's weird in a hierarchy. Status matters. So you've got to elevate some of them. It signals to everyone beneath them in their generation that their generation matters. It signals to the seniors that things are changing, and that's okay. And now you got different voices sitting at the table that you need at the table. So that was probably 3 or 4 things just off the cuff, but it's a fascinating question because you can be retired on the job for the next 10 or 15, dear boomer, or you can really tickle your brain and help some others maximize what they're capable of on your way out. That's got to be the preferable path.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I really appreciate all of the advice you've provided for listeners out there, the classes that you've got out in the world, the book that you now have out in the world. And I've enjoyed our conversation. Where can people get the book?
Very kind. Anywhere you buy books, you should be able to find this.
All right. And where can they find all your lessons? I think you mentioned LinkedIn Learning, but is that the only platform? Are there other platforms where they can get your courses?
I have a small number of things over at Udemy, but the vast majority of what I've done is at LinkedIn Learning. And if anyone listening to this has questions or comments to me, just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to chat. And the courses are found on LinkedIn Learning.
Wonderful. Well, Todd, thank you very much. Again, I've really enjoyed our just shy of an hour together. Got me thinking about some good things, and hopefully got some others out there thinking about their leadership approach and career management and things like that.
My pleasure, man.